we could all give hugs to one another and have coffee with one another. I'm longing for those days to return, and let us just hope that we're going to be on the other side of this pandemic soon, and our summers will be warm, as Chuck was reminding us that the sun is reminding us that times are changing. I want to also just make one comment. Stephanie Voss, who's going to be doing the poetry work, as many of you know, she was a Lutheran pastor, and then was kind of asked not to be a Lutheran pastor anymore by the Lutherans because she was a little bit too radical and had some doubts and questions about everything, and sort of just was in the wilderness for a while. Well, she's a member of First Universalists and is now in the process of becoming a Unitarian Universalist minister. I just filled out one of her letters of recommendation this weekend, and we are so excited that she's going to be joining our fellowship and our faith. She's the kind of young person that's going to help lead us into the next generation of Unitarian Universalist leadership.
I don't know if you know this, but she is our once a month consulting minister.
Oh, I didn't even, I thought that she was, but I just want to share that how excited I am that she's with you even more. And just so glad that she found a home with you and with us. And it's just fantastic. The future is bright with people like her. So I'm going to tell you a little story. A few weeks ago on a Tuesday, we had our regular weekly church staff meeting. And the Karen, me, who likes to joke around, which some of you know me a little bit more, the Karen that likes to make up funny names for colleagues, which I do much to the disappointment of them sometimes. The Karen who's always connecting the dots of ideas, the Karen that is a appropriately optimistic you who makes inappropriate jokes sometimes, did not come to that staff meeting. Someone else came. The Karen that came to that meeting had been holding on to something from her other job. She'd been having difficulty with a particular staff person who's since now gone. But during check-in at church, I started crying, thinking about this interaction with this other staff person. Because he had made a joke, a stupid joke, a joke about the Ku Klux Klan, a joke that hurt my feelings, hurt my heart, froze my body, and stunned me into complete silence. When it happened, not one utterance did I make. The tears and the sounds that I made at the end of the staff meeting were genuine and needed, and they were sounds of love for my colleagues who could hold me and gird me, my UU minister colleagues. The tears and sounds that I shared with them came out were a melody of grief, a poem of loss, a litany for my diminished humanity. This was a lament. This was what many of us call an ugly cry. An ugly cry. Friends, for some of us, all we may know about the word lamentations maybe is from the Bible, an amazing book of lamentation written by the prophet Jeremiah in the Hebrew scriptures. But the poetry of lamentation is found in all oral literature, in all languages and cultures across the globe. It can be found in ancient Egyptian. Aspen, this is not the time. No, I'm serious. I am terribly sorry. In Yoruba, in Chinese, in Sanskrit, and in Hindi. A lament has many faces. Yes, it is mourning, but not always about death. Mourning not for a purpose, but an existential wail as primal as a child's need to cry. Throughout human history, probably from the Australopithecines who lost babies in childbirth in the Rift Valley, to the children who watched their father being shot in the backseat of a car in Kenosha. Lament is a way of bearing the unbearable. This is what humans do. It is a need we have. To say no, to say why, to say help. Laments tell the truth of suffering that is smothering our worthiness, our dreams, our ability to work towards a better day and a better life. Naming these horrors is an unrestrained lament, helps us mold into a people who respond with an emphatic no to the ways our nation and our communities are turned into graven images of hatred and despair. Lamenting is healing, and the need for healing is paramount the world over. Therefore, the loss of lament in Western culture is lamentable. I believe that one of the reasons we have trouble lamenting in this country is the imprint of Christian theology on our secular culture. Think about it, friends. It is not fashionable for people to feel and show emotions. How often do we see folks apologize when they start to cry, even though they've suffered a great loss and this is the most natural reaction? Some people even apologize for apologizing. In our culture, we've come to think of such powerful expressions of grief as ugly, and therefore seek to avoid them, to avoid even seeing them, much less grieving like this ourselves. Eventually, though, idealism about what one is facing when it doesn't match up with reality will give way to weariness, trauma, grief, and suffering. But there's nothing to be ashamed of concerning sorrow, misery, or lamentation. Now, many of us are UUs because we were dissatisfied with the traditional Christian responses that do not serve those caught in the grip of suffering. They are based on doctrinal constructs that don't always correspond with people's real life experiences. This theodicy problem, the problem of evil, theodicy is what do you say about evil, has long been recognized as a dilemma in Christian theology, and especially after the Shoah in Jewish theology. God's authority is asserted with the words omnipotent, omnipresent, all powerful. And this thinking asserts that if something goes wrong, terribly wrong, horribly wrong, it must be the fault of the sufferer. So, does the all good God allow suffering for whatever reason, as punishment for sin, as a test of faith, as a means of saving others, to impart some moral lesson? This thinking trivializes and justifies people's suffering, which causes more harm than aid. But friends, we can't get too comfortable shaking our heads at the Christian theology. The same problem exists with our secular liberal democracy, starting with the Declaration of Independence. The words don't always match up with reality. So does the all good democracy allow suffering for whatever reason as a punishment for my blackness, as a test of my patriotism, as a means of saving whiteness to impart a moral lesson on people of color? This thinking trivializes and justifies the victim's suffering, which causes more harm. If people are to move from purely passive endurance of suffering to suffering that can humanize them in a productive way, then one of the things they need is a language that is honest, relevant, and thoughtful. Now, 1,000 years ago, women from the Hunan province in central China were denied literacy and imprisoned, and their feet were bound to the size of 3 inches when they reached 7 years old. They fought back, though, and they took revenge in this suffering by inventing a secret written language, incomprehensible to men, called Nushu. This female language, Nushu, Nushu, this female language, now on the verge of extinction, was only recently discovered, having been confined to one place all their lives. These Chinese women felt a desperate need for a language in which to protest and bewail their situation in support of each other. Today, the access to this language in the form of the ancient tradition has recently been documented and published. This literature was a way for these women to bear the unbearable through a self defined language of lament. In this community, lament was both communal and private. It spoke with political, social, and religious voices. It called on spiritual entities and higher powers to be accountable, and at the same time, it called upon them for aid and relief. It accuses the system and it praises the deep spirituality. They were subversive and political and spiritual all at once as they lamented. So, lamentation then is about release, about letting the painful emotions flow, letting fear fly free, letting doubt invade your thoughts, letting bewilderment puzzle you, letting anger absorb you, and letting shame and guilt shatter you at most of all, let sadness in. During that staff meeting, that release of energy was accompanied by noises from me, the sounds of crying, sobbing, shouting, sighing, even a little whimpering, and my tears fell. Resisting difficult emotions is often my own default defense. It's not easy to endure those feelings, let alone welcome them. It's hard to allow ourselves to feel the hurt. I did that when my dad died when I was 19. Dropped dead of a heart attack, just like that. Never got to say goodbye, never got to see me grow up. And I ignored that lament for years. But if we ignore that lament, we displace the resulting serenity of understanding and acceptance. I never was able until many years later to assimilate that loss, assimilate my lament into my spirit, and embody that awful pain with self compassion and right actions. Before we step out into the strength with determination to fight for justice or an emotional equilibrium, we must allow and create space for our pain and for our tears. For it's in these places we find true strength to bear the unbearable. When we let lament flow its natural course, we ready ourselves to engage with life anew and move forward. Without lamentation, without the emotional healing, advancing towards resolution, this cannot happen. In which case, misery can only persist. Now, we use avoid lamenting. The absence of lament in our liturgy and many of our churches over the 25 years that I've been a minister results sometimes in something I've noticed of a loss of memory. We forget the reality of suffering and pain and go too quickly to righteous indignation and moral outrage. We are in a time of displaced people, friends, with insurrections, neo fascism, wars, exile, abuse, fear, hatred, uprisings, poverty, depression, and deep nationwide anxiety. We cannot approach these concerns with just our long held values and pristine beliefs. Any theological reflection that observes the suffering of the have nots, those people, my neighbors, that results in you calling Black people to see how they're doing after another visual of their degraded humanity has been plastered across the television. Anytime you call somebody, I got lots of those calls. How are you doing? Anytime I heard one of those calls, I said, have you been lamenting? Have you been crying? These calls to me sometimes minimize the onslaught of being hunted like an animal. Lament with me, I said. Lament with me. The triumphalism of the haves that place a Black Lives Matter sticker on their Facebook page is too neat and tidy for the power of my cries. Lament with me, please. Any theology of hope and celebration is incomplete and inhumane. Lament with me. Lamenting is risky speech, whereas a Protestant theologian, Walter Brueggemann, says lamenting is dangerous, restless speech. Friends, when our tears become ideas and our emotions become political, lamentation can become a dangerous, powerful, provocative tool because it challenges power structures. It calls for justice. It pushes the boundaries of our relationship with each other and pushes our spirits to the absolute human limits. It refuses to settle for the status quo, reminding us that the powers that be, that this human situation is unacceptable and that we must act. Laments are irreversible. When spoken, it is done and cannot be recalled. It takes risk because one never knows until the act is done whether one has gone too far. The ancient Hebrew ritual of lament includes the tearing of one's clothes and then putting on a sackcloth made of goat's hair and crying out to God one's lament. I end now with reading a part of the book of Lamentation by Jeremiah. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears and tears are upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her, they have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to hear her appointed feasts. All her gateways are desolate, her priests groan, her maidens grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Blessed be and amen to all of your laments.
Thank you so much. Let's take a moment of silence before we move on.